Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. I'm Craig Jeffery. I'm your host for this episode. I'm joined by Royston Costa from Ferguson Enterprises. Royston, thank you for joining me on the podcast again.
Hey, Craig. Looking forward to this session on blockchain.
Yeah, we'll get into just a little bit about Royston's bio for those who haven't listened to the other podcasts we've done. Today's episode is called Blockchain, the Great Hope for Know Your Customer. But let's get into it. Maybe we could start, Royston, with a quick definition, maybe a layman's definition for what is blockchain.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, Craig. And as much as I feel this is probably one of the simplest definitions, it's impossible not to use one or two buzzwords in there. Blockchain technology is a decentralized digital ledger that records transactions across many computers in a way that ensures the data is secure, transparent, and tamper-resistant. It also allows information to be shared without a central authority, with each transaction being verified by a network of users, creating a chain of blocks that cannot, and that's very important in terms of blockchain, cannot be altered once recorded. That's it. That's simply what blockchain is. I know it sounds simple, but there's a lot more around it.
I'm not sure it sounded simple. It sounded clear, but there sound like there's a lot of parts, like it's secure, it's transparent, it can't be identified. You know, the decentralized part is, instead of like central, like let's say everything's stored at a bank or at a central bank, now it's stored and saved on different ledgers or different sources of truth that can be checked. On the transparent side, that'll be interesting when we talk about KYC, because there's some aspects of you don't want information about know your customer for everyone to look at. And so there's limits to that transparency.
And these are where you get some of the challenges and hurdles that we need to overcome, or that need to be overcome by the industry. But one thing I want to stress here, Greg, and you're quite right, it's hard to really, in my view, I mean, sure, there's probably someone has got a better definition in terms of layman's terms, but I feel that, you know, it's a technology that you don't want to, when I say underestimate, but also misinterpret, because all those words are quite important in themselves. You know, the decentralized you mentioned, and of course being secure, and then the fact that also, you know, you're creating a chain of blocks. It depends on the audience as well, but you know, someone who's not maybe working in treasury, or maybe has a kind of exposure to the types of technologies that are already available, might not understand what does that actually mean. So, you know, the degree to which you can go into explaining this in kind of like really, really broken, and there's a way of doing that. But I just felt getting a basic definition, but also at the same time not wishing to insult anyone's intelligence, this is probably the best definition I've come across. Believe you me, I've actually got a more complex definition I can read out now, but I don't think, you know, you'd want me to do that. So in terms of decentralization, I mean, it's pretty obvious. That is referring to no central authority controlling the data. One thing I should mention though, and again, when you look at any technology, there's always going to be some evolution or some sort of variation, and blockchain is no different. I am aware that they have what they call a closed loop and an open loop. So probably the definition I've given is more open loop, which means that anyone, in theory, could access this blockchain, but they'd have to be able to go through all the kind of the steps that I've described in the definition, and that's usually very well managed. But you can also have a closed loop. In other words, thinking of KYC, potentially, you could have just a bank using this technology for just its customers and not the whole world, let's say, you know, in theory. So there's that definite possibility. So I still like to think in terms of the underlying technology, there's the possibility and the potential for it to still be very powerful when it comes to KYC.
That makes a lot of sense. And as we get into where's the value of blockchain and KYC, I did just have a couple thoughts came to mind as you were describing that. And the definition is good. I mean, it's fairly complex technology that can be understood in a reasonable manner. You know, I was thinking how people used to transmit data in the past. It was you would have a leased line. There would be a physical line that ran through, let's say, the telecom company, point to point. Maybe you're communicating with your bank. And so you pay for a line. It's a point-to-point line. Well, our phone systems have long been you call and it routes it in different ways. And then many, many years ago, the internet came about, and that you would send an email or you send a file and it over the internet, and it has all these packets, and those packets may travel different paths, so it becomes more decentralized in terms of the journey. So that's true with our tech. And then this authority, the authority is no longer, it's sitting at, let's say, a particular bank or a particular entity. It's now on all these ledgers. And so we've gone to the more distributed methods of communication, more the distributed, the concepts that support distributed ledger technology, right? It's a democratization of those ledgers. But, as you think about the value of blockchain and KYC, what makes that the potential great hope? Where's the value in KYC?
Without question. And I just want to also add, if you think in terms of beyond KYC, because it's kind of just as powerful and important, think payments. And I know you're already aware that, cryptocurrency uses blockchain as its underlying technology. But let me kind of answer your question regarding the benefits and the value add, particularly with KYC. So I mentioned about, obviously in some ways the decentralization being sort of distributed network of participants, transparency. All participants have access to the same version of that ledger. So thinking initially maybe your bank, and you could, I would imagine, within that same network can limit who sees, because you wouldn't want your data to be visible necessarily to everyone, but you might be happy with it to be visible to some of your vendors or parties that you specifically agree to authorize to view that data. I think this is, again, a very powerful benefit, which is security. Data on a blockchain is secured by what they call cryptographic algorithms, and that makes it extremely difficult for an unauthorized party to alter that information without detection. That's a very key point. There's also another attribute for blockchain, which they call immutability, which is basically once that data is recorded and confirmed, and this is interesting, I know with this day and age, no one can say it's 100% foolproof, but it is virtually, and that's much better than what we have today, frankly. It's virtually impossible to change, ensuring that the integrity and the permanence of that transaction history still remains. So again, for something like KYC, definitely a leap forward. There's an element in terms of how blockchain works that there's something they call the consensus mechanism, which relies basically on, the various counterparties or parties involved to validate these transactions that ensures only legitimate transactions are added to the chain. So we're talking about blockchain, but let's be clear. In my mind, we're looking to solve a problem. And this problem has been KYC. And the reason it's a problem and has been a problem is because we all are required, banks, corporates, fintechs, to comply to regulation. And, depending on the territory you happen to be residing in, that compliance could be quite difficult, could be quite light. But I think whichever territory you live in, even if it's supposedly light, one would still say that it's still quite painful to have to produce documentation. And let's say because KYC in this case, we're really thinking in terms of banks. If you're working for a corporate where you have to open a huge number of accounts or regularly open accounts, then this process is not only painful in terms of the mechanism that we need to use to get that documentation to the bank, and I'll address that in a second, but it's also in terms of the number of times that needs to be done and what's acceptable by the bank. So what I meant in terms of the mechanism that you might use to get to the bank, there are some corporates, including ourselves, that can, and frankly, at a very basic level, you think of DocuSign, can get digitized documents produced fairly easily. But not all the banks accept that, or not all the banks are prepared to receive that digitized level of communication. So, you kind of already up against a challenge there where it doesn't matter what technology you might be able to use at your side or your corporate side, you're limited by what you can share with, in this case, a bank, or it could be another third party. And this is why I feel like with blockchain, there's an obvious solution in my mind that is just begging to kind of address that issue. I do recognize it's not something that we can immediately implement because it still needs to be developed and evolved and packaged in a way that makes that, the bank's satisfied that they're comfortable with the controls around it, and we as the corporate, the customer, which is as always what we're looking for, get the value.
Yeah, it seems like so many banks are trying to reduce the complexity and the friction in the KYC process. Some of them have these portals where you're loading documents, they're signing documents, they're asking for more information, something gets bumped out. This is one of the elements that, is when we do surveys, what are the pain points? It's all KYC is so high up to the top. Sometimes it's described more into terms of bank account management, and if that includes KYC. Secure email seems to be falling down. That doesn't seem to be as high of an issue as it used to be. That was another pain point, right? I've got to do these different logins. The emails disappear. This is not so helpful. But KYC has always been a big pain point.
To your point on emails, I think, again, it's one of those classic cases. And I was at a conference yesterday. It was so refreshing as whenever you get the chance to go outside your little bubble, let's say, to hear other people talking about this type of challenge, let's call it that, whether it's AI, blockchain, whatever. It's interesting for me, like you said, with the email, to some degree, that potentially has been mitigated fairly naturally by some of the tools that we use. So if you think of Teams, that's quite a secure environment and portal to use for communication internally anyway. And you could use it for external communication, but obviously you need to authorize that individual. But I think with emails, there is an element now where, banks included use their portals for exchanging messages, and then they'll send you an alert by email, which you then have to go into to try and, get the access to that message. So I think, in other words, whereas previously there may not been an option for accessing secure emails, there is now, but admittedly you have to go through a couple of additional steps to be able to be authorized to access that message. I think the issue with KYC, and I'm going to repeat myself a couple of times because I think it's such a, like you said, a big pain point, is it's been around for so long. And let's be clear, I'm not suggesting that KYC is not important or, that it's a good thing, actually. It is a good thing for both us and for our bank. So I definitely agree with the requirement for KYC. The issue is when we look at where we are today in society in terms of technology, and frankly, if you think about if you wanted to open a bank account for yourself personally, and I know it's a big difference between a corporate and an individual, but you can see why people immediately make that comparison. You can do that within 2 minutes, 5 minutes if you're going to stretch it, online, on your phone at that. So there's an immediate kind of a question mark then, well, it can be that easy to open an account in your own name. In terms of the principle, why can't we have a similar experience? Admittedly, it's a corporate. Admittedly, you have to be more stringent, and there's a lot more regulation. Let me go through some of the hurdles. Why don't I do that now, just to kind of remind ourselves, or at least highlight, I guess, the reasons why blockchain has been is taking longer to implement. And this is something that I got from Swift, a document that Swift issued a few years ago when they first looked at blockchain. And it was quite interesting because they highlighted, I think it's about 7 or 8 areas which they would suggest that for any technology, and I think this does apply to any technology, but in this case, we're looking really at blockchain, to pass, for it to be fully acceptable, certainly to themselves, and I guess in terms of the paper, the wider world. So let me just go through those. Strong governance. It has to have a governance model that clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of the various parties, as well as the business and technical operating rules. And if I were to address that, I would say the nature of blockchain is decentralized. So there you already have a major issue. Who's going to be governing that? But I do believe that and what we're seeing is a lot, in most cases where technologies come in and you think, oh, you can't do it because of that, can't do that. There are people that haven't had a chance, and governments for them haven't had a chance to review what are the mitigating actions that can be acceptable. So in terms of strong governance, I would say, yes, there isn't that immediate control, if you like, but it could still be looked at perhaps from in terms of within, let's say the UK. Could be a bank to start with within the UK, and then hopefully it builds up from there. At some point, and I don't know how long that's going to take, it could become a regional network, European banks, maybe, European regulation, and we have that, bunch of that already for a number of areas. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I do believe that's potentially the way it could progress. So that's just the first point.
You mentioned SWIFT, and it made me think of, SWIFT as a communications network. Has, all these banks join, they want to do business with each other. They have a whole structure for being able to share and just turn on other counterparties so you don't have to send everything all together. So they've been doing that. How do we make the ability to trade, to communicate effectively? And that also ties into their whole, like their example of the closed user group, right? You can be on the SWIFT network. A bank can also set up something for other banks or for their corporate customers that says, here's how we operate within this model. So that's like a microcosm of some of what we're talking about here. But strong governance is number one. What's the second?
And just quickly on the point you made about SWIFT. So, and this is, I've not been involved in the project. They were working on trying to introduce a solution for KYC. But I would imagine that, they are a much larger group, and they're talking about 15,000 banks globally. And whereas my example, I was saying, well, maybe you start off with just one or two banks, or in fact, just one bank, and then build it up from there. But the second point, data controls, controlling the data access and availability to preserve that data confidentiality. So we discussed that earlier in terms of, confidential and GDPR. Then again, this is, I think, always been the age-old challenge for not just banks, but corporates. Compliance with regulatory requirements. And I should have probably, or at least I would add within that, local regulatory requirements, because there's the local regulatory requirements. In some cases, there's the international regulatory requirements. But either way, it's the same. It's a challenge. So the ability to comply with that needs to be also considered. The fourth point is standardization. And remember, we're looking at how this is going to be rolled out, and we think of vast, in some cases, the global landscape. Standardization at all levels to guarantee straight-through processing, interoperability, and backward compatibility. So this is SWIFT typically, looking at the solution to say, we've got to think in terms of how we process our traffic, and is this technology going to be able to withstand the requirements of what we're currently able to offer. So totally get that. And I'm not saying this is something that's going to be a solution that can be come up with tomorrow, but it's certainly, I think it's certainly achievable. The fifth one, identity framework, the ability to identify parties involved to ensure accountability and non-repudiation of financial transactions. That should be relatively straightforward for SWIFT, I would imagine. It's the first thing you would expect as a member of SWIFT. Security and cyber defense, again, very important. The ability to detect, prevent, and resist cyber attacks, which are growing in number and sophistication. So again, I would feel, given what SWIFT has done in that area, this should be a slam dunk for them. Not saying it's something you could take, you should be lax or relaxed about, but it's something that they're very good on. They're very good on cyber and sort of the right level of controls. And then I think we're getting to the parts where perhaps if you've got past the first five, then you're really kind of putting in the, well, I wouldn't say icing on the cake, but these are just as important, but perhaps in my view, not so, it shouldn't be as big a hurdle to overcome. Reliability, readiness to support mission critical financial services. I mean, SWIFT have an excellent reputation for that. Whatever they would implement, they'd want to make sure that's not going to disrupt that performance. And the last bit, I think, is the key one in respect of certainly SWIFT and any other fintech or bank that were looking to implement this type of technology. Scalability, readiness to scale to support services. You process hundreds, if not millions, thousands of transactions per second. Totally understand why, certainly from a Swift perspective, this would be, or it's still being worked on in terms of rolling out a solution for KYC. But what I would say, Craig, is it's a good starting point. Because, when you look at these points anyway, and I would say if I revisit them again, I could, and like I did with some of them, I say, well, we've got that one. Okay, this one's a bit more challenging, but none of those to me look like insurmountable. I'm not saying they're easy to fix, but I don't think they're insurmountable. It would take a fair bit of effort by a number of stakeholders. But my approach and my view generally with even in terms of projects is not in all cases, but certainly in terms of the experience I've had, is sometimes it's better to go for a phased approach rather than big bang. Try and get what will work in place. I'm not saying roll it out to everyone. I'm talking about sort of like how you test and what have you, and get that working, making sure it's kind of, really robust. Then go on to the next stage and say, right, okay, well, that works really well. That's gone. I'm sure this is all happening, but in terms of, how I see this evolving. And so I'd like to think, what time frame, sooner the better, but I would say maybe the next 5 years at least, because technology is evolving so quickly. Because, there's a possibility that with KYC being around as long as it has in nature, in the way that we currently communicate with banks, who's to say that whole requirement, I wouldn't say there's that requirement of having to produce sort of the relevant regulatory documents is going to go away, but the nature of KYC goes away. And what I'm probably thinking of there, and this is probably a bit too futuristic, is we are kind of heading slowly but surely into the digital identification kind of phase, let's call it that. Some countries already have that for their citizens. Not all countries use it. I mean, we have, certainly in the UK, I know you probably have in the US, a digital kind of bar on your passport, but we still have to hold a document, book in our hand to get through. At some point, I can see that being completely digital. And if you're in that sort of space and you're looking at that, then why can't all this be completely digitized? And eventually, blockchain is digital. But it's ironic that I've been talking about blockchain in a way that sort of, let's say, helps to supplement the process we have currently, which is kind of still manual, should we say, in terms of getting documents to the bank. So my thinking was, okay, so we get this document and then we kind of submit to the bank. Now, ideally, that should be in a digital form, but in some cases, there might be a copy that we attach and maybe upload, or sometimes it could be even a hard copy that needs to be signed with wet signatures and sent to the bank. So those are kind of the backdrop to what I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is that all those, and this will come very much, in my view, through regulation, because I think it's governments that will drive this change. That could all go away because governments say, right, interesting enough, I think it's Estonia have already implemented a blockchain solution for their citizens in terms of in their health service. So, and this is not this year, this is like, I think 3 or 4 years ago. So it's been done. And I think that's the other point I wanted to bring to your attention, yourself and your listeners, is that when you hear of these, and okay, I immediately thought about this and I thought the immediate argument would be, well, Estonia is a very small country with all due respect to Estonia. You couldn't necessarily just say, oh, well, we'll do that in the US or we'll do that in the UK. Understood. But the fact that it has worked, and admittedly it's worked in a smaller population or demographic, should give us hope.
That's a good point. The whole authority for IDs or digital awareness, what's done at the national level, what's done at a subdivision level or smaller than that in the U.S. states or provinces in Canada, and then there might even be other jurisdictions. So all those items make sense. Let me ask another question, Royston, on this. I recently reviewed technology predictions I made about 8 years ago. I was going through them. The first couple, I was like, oh, I was spot on. And then there were some I was like, okay, that's not right. And then one on bank account management, I was mentioning how within 10 years, I thought it would come to play, because when bank account management came up, EBAM, electronic bank account management, this idea of conversations and files that could be shared over Swift or through communications, right? There's all these conversations to say, I want to set up an account, here's a new signer, and it all goes digitally. People and companies were like, this would be great because the process is terrible. And the banks were like, this would be great, the process is terrible. And so the banks set up things on the back end to handle it. And then all the corporations are like, all our bank account stuff, or many of the corporations, all our bank account stuff is in paper files or in different spreadsheets. We don't have systems. Now, a bit has changed, right? It's the readiness for the tech requires certain things to be in place, just like your rideshare app. Well, your rideshare app doesn't work if there's not the internet. There's not geolocation or GPS activity or the ability to make payments. So all those things came together so that you could, see where the driver is, make payment on it, rate things. All those things can happen. It came through because, phones were there. There's the wireless network. All those things happen. EBAM was too early, right? Corporations weren't ready on the back end. So I don't think my prediction for how much it would be adopted in 2 years is going to come true there. But more things are coming together now, would you say, on the tech side? I mean, you mentioned maybe 5 years. What's your prediction or your outlook maybe, if that sounds too much, your outlook for if it's the great hope, when will that hope be partially realized and then fully realized?
That's a tough question because I want to say in my kind of most optimistic view is that we've already got it. It is out there, but how useful, how good is that to, let's say, you or me, where we are not physically be able to use it with our particular bank? So the challenge comes in, and I'm thinking in terms of the term, the gist of your question is, when is it going to be widely available? So that, we're not even talking about it as a pain point anymore. It's just like, sometimes when you talk about banking platforms, what does your banking platform do? I'm sure that most banking platforms are able to import, let's say, a file from your ERP solution. If your banking platform can't do that, then that's really bad. That's poor. But you might then say, oh, but my bank does it so much easier because it's just, this interface works, or an API, and so on and so forth. And you can have different levels. So in terms of trying to answer your question, I want to say that, and I don't know this for sure, so that's my bad, but I'm almost confident there's a bank out there that's already doing this, but is perhaps not one of the larger international banks. If I'm thinking in terms of what would make more sense is when it's more widely available, at least you've got 2 or 3, certainly large international banks that are offering this. I don't see any reason, again, why it shouldn't be available within 5 years. And it sounds aggressive. And I'll tell you one of the reasons why I've had that confidence. And was before, if you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I'd been a lot less confident about some of these technologies being able to be developed and scale up. It's a cliche, but it's a fact as well, which is the world is moving at such an exponential pace that everything we talk about is outdated, literally, if not within the same day, the next day, and in smaller bits, smaller sort of parts, but it is. So first of all, I would say with the way that we've got a changing demographic in the workplace, and ironically, it's the same period, I believe, in the next 5 years, the current generation that are officially due to retire by the year 2030 will have retired or will have left the workplace. Some have already left as a result of the pandemic. So the point behind that is you've got a younger average workforce who have high expectations, and I said higher, not high, but also are more familiar with technology than, say, my generation were. So there's an element there where, some of the fintech banks that are coming out with very innovative solutions using generative AI are pushing that whole agenda so that these, let's say, the more traditional banks cannot, in my view, afford to ignore what's happening around them and what's being asked of them by corporates. I know we're not talking about this per se, but interesting enough, payments, which I did mention to earlier, is also a prime candidate for blockchain technology for this almost identical reasons, slightly different pain points. Transparency. Still do not have transparency for payments today. No matter what you tell me, I've heard and I've experienced very recently a payment, where's it going astray? We knew exactly where it was, but we couldn't get it back for it was six days. And one treasurer said to me it was a large amount that he couldn't get back for 2 weeks. And the banks involved had absolutely no control in what we were being told in getting that payment back to us immediately. So blockchain, there's no question that would happen. It can't, because you've got that digital trail and it's all instant. And I know some of the banks already have their own solutions using blockchain, like JP Morgan and Onyx. But 5 years, I bet you we talk next year and I'll be thinking, oh, maybe I should have 3 years. But no, seriously, this has gone on for so long, just as much as cash flow forecasting. And that's another pain point, which is not really an issue with the banks, but it's certainly a pain point that treasurers have been faced for so long, is now a lot more tangible. And why is that? Primarily, in my view, because of AI. AI has democratized the ability for us to get over some of the hurdles internally in trying to connect systems together. And also APIs obviously fall into that bracket. But these are just examples of why I believe that for blockchain, 5 years, I would expect there to be a solution that's much more widely available than just, say, the one bank.
I think of Yogi Berra. You may have heard of Yogi Berraisms. I think this is the way he said it. It's predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. The silliness of that, right? It's predictions about the past, of course, would be different. But to your point about the technology being more in place, the need is there. It's a key issue. And then, it's interesting how you talked about, you didn't use the term digital natives, but the newer entrants into the workforce are coming in impatient not to do things the old way. We used to print paper on logs and carry it to the bank, while we were fighting, bears. It's just, there's an intolerance for very manual, the older style methods. And that's having an impact. That's driving some technology decisions at companies because, other people are like, you just got to not be lazy and do that. And they're like, this is not being lazy. It's like, why would we do something that's dumb or suboptimal? And that's pushing along. So I think those things together, those things come together. The tech is available. There's more, particularly because you can do this through a bank. You may not have to be fully digital on the corporate side, but you could use portals and use that information so that it could be shared more broadly. I think there's a number of things that make this more likely. So I'm going to agree with you on the 5 years. I wouldn't go with you on the 3 years. I'm not going to go that far. So maybe we can go back and say there will be some doing it for sure. I mean, I just seeing what the bank portals are doing. We've used those in our staffing roles, and I'm like, they're getting a lot better. And these are some of the $1 trillion banks. And so as this framework becomes possible, that should be really good. I really like your comments, Royston. The great hope for KYC is blockchain. I think that's true. I think I'm more convinced that it's true. Thank you so much.
No, you're welcome. And just to a couple of things in terms of examples today, and I sort of just wanted to add those at the end. 2 areas that already use blockchain technology. So this is an area where they're not thinking about it. There's not a kind of proof of concept that's being discussed. It's happening. Smart contracts, personal identity security. I know it's a whole different, you could argue, ballgame, but to me, quite often when people use these, let's say, call them reasons, I think excuses, I don't think it's acceptable in the sense that, like I said before, if Estonia is using blockchain already for the purposes they are, then we have an obligation, not just because of that, but generally to be able to say, well, why shouldn't we consider and try and pursue this? Because at the end of the day, what were we trying to do? I'm always a big believer in we're not looking for a solution that hasn't got a problem. We're looking for a solution that is going to address this problem. Otherwise, why wouldn't we be talking about it? And it, in many respects, will help, I think, with other areas of the business, because if it can be applied to this area with banks, surely we can apply it to other areas for regulation. Surely. I mean, that's the way the kind of the wider benefits. And again, like always with these things, and I know we haven't had time to look at this specifically, but I quite often, when I do some of my presentations, I'm reminded of some of the films Hollywood released, which go back 30 to 40 years, that showcase technology that we're still thinking about today. So it's quite ironic in some ways. And one of the ones that springs to mind is Disclosure with Michael Douglas and Demi Moore back in the 90s. And they were talking about augmented reality and holographic imaging. And it's fascinating that I know Citibank Hollow, which is their product that they use for trading, is almost identical to what this the technology that was showcased in this film 30 years ago. Actually, it's 30, yeah. So, I mean, again, talking about being creative and talking about where the future is, it's not new in my view. This is not new. What's new is working in the world we've worked in, treasury, like you said, been used to working with paper in the past, but now looking at the potentials and the potential benefits and efficiencies that we can gain from some of these technologies. But we can only keep trying, I guess, is what I'd say.
Thank you so much, Royston.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.